John chapter 11, verses 1 to 16. Now a man named Lazarus was ill. He was from Bethany, the village of Mary and her sister Martha. This Mary, whose brother Lazarus now lay ill, was the same one who poured perfume on the Lord and wiped his feet with her hair. So the sisters sent word to Jesus, "Lord, the one you love is ill." When he heard this, Jesus said, "This illness will not end in death. No, it is for God's glory, so that God's Son may be glorified through it." Now Jesus loved Martha and her sister and Lazarus. So when he heard that Lazarus was ill, he stayed where he was 2 more days. And then he said to his disciples, "Let us go back to Judea." "But Rabbi," they said, "a short while ago the Jews there tried to stone you, and yet you are going back." Jesus answered, "Are there not 12 hours of daylight? Anyone who walks in the daytime will not stumble, for they see by the world's light. It is when a person walks at night that they stumble, for they have no light." After he had said this, he went on to tell them, "Our friend Lazarus has fallen asleep, but I am going there to wake him up." His disciples replied, "Lord, if he sleeps, he will get better." Jesus had been speaking of his death, but his disciples thought he meant natural sleep. So then he told them plainly, "Lazarus is dead, and for your sake I am glad I was not there, so that you may believe. Let us go to him." Then Thomas, also known as Didymus, said to the rest of the disciples, "Let us also go, that we may die with him."
He's an unidentified flying object, you will see him in the air. He's an unidentified flying object, you will drop your hands and stare. You will be afraid to tell your neighbors, they might think that it's not true. But when you look them in their faces, you will know they've seen him too. He will come back like he promised, with a price already paid. He will gather up his followers and take them all away.
He's an unidentified flying object, he will sweep down from the sky. He's an unidentified flying object, he's in some sleep but will not die. He's an unidentified flying object, coming back to you at home. He's an unidentified flying object, he will roll away your stone.
And if there's lives on other planets, then I'm sure that he must know. And he's been there once already and has died to save their souls. He's an unidentified flying object, you will see him in the air. He's an unidentified flying object, you will drop your hands and stare. He's an unidentified flying object, coming back to take you home. He's an unidentified flying object, he will roll away your stone.
John chapter 11, verses 17 to 44. On his arrival, Jesus found that Lazarus had already been in the tomb for 4 days. Now Bethany was less than 2 miles from Jerusalem, and many Jews had come to Martha and Mary to comfort them in the loss of their brother. When Martha heard that Jesus was coming, she went out to meet him, but Mary stayed at home. "Lord," Martha said to Jesus, "if you had been here, my brother would not have died. But I know that even now God will give you whatever you ask." Jesus said to her, "Your brother will rise again." Martha answered, "I know he will rise again in the resurrection at the last day." Jesus said to her, "I am the resurrection and the life. The one who believes in me will live even though they die, and whoever lives by believing in me will never die. Do you believe this?" "Yes, Lord," she replied. "I believe that you are the Messiah, the Son of God, who is to come into the world." After she had said this, she went back and called her sister Mary aside. "The teacher is here," she said, "and is asking for you." When Mary heard this, she got up quickly and went to him. Now Jesus had not yet entered the village, but was still at the place where Martha had met him. When the Jews who had been with Mary in the house, comforting her, noticed how quickly she got up and went out, they followed her, supposing she was going to the tomb to mourn there. When Mary reached the place where Jesus was and saw him, she fell at his feet and said, "Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died." When Jesus saw her weeping, and the Jews who had come along with her also weeping, he was deeply moved in spirit and troubled. "Where have you laid him?" he asked. "Come and see, Lord," they replied. Jesus wept. Then the Jews said, "See how he loved him." But some of them said, "Could not he who opened the eyes of the blind man have kept this man from dying?" Jesus, once more deeply moved, came to the tomb. It was a cave with a stone laid across the entrance. "Take away the stone," he said. "But Lord," said Martha, the sister of the dead man, "by this time there is a bad odor, for he has been there 4 days." Then Jesus said, "Did I not tell you that if you believe, you will see the glory of God?" So they took away the stone. Then Jesus looked up and said, "Father, I thank you that you have heard me. I knew that you always hear me. But I said this for the benefit of the people standing here, that they may believe that you sent me." When he had said this, Jesus called out in a loud voice, "Lazarus, come out!" The dead man came out, his hands and feet wrapped with strips of linen, and a cloth round his face. Jesus said to them, "Take off the grave clothes and let him go."
So we turn our attention now to chapter 11 of the Gospel of John and the story of the death of Lazarus. Now, a number of years ago, when I was first becoming interested in Christianity, I came across a book called Lazarus. But this wasn't written from a Christian point of view. This was a secular book, and the author imagined what it would be like for Lazarus to have been raised from the dead and then have to live out his life as someone who felt displaced and miserable because of his sudden resurrection and his inability to understand it. Now, everything that we see here lets us know that this is not the case. Lazarus was raised from the dead, and there is no reason to believe that in due course and in the normal course of things that Lazarus would not die again. Unlike Jesus, who was raised from the dead by the power of the Holy Spirit after his crucifixion, and who after 40 days was taken up into heaven, and who we are promised will come back on the clouds of heaven, as we heard in our song just a little while ago. Lazarus is like us, but with a strange quirk in what happened to him, because God wanted to reveal through his life something of the ministry of Jesus and the comfort that God has for people like Mary and her sister Martha, who were grieving the loss of their brother. And Jesus, at the very beginning of this passage, says to his disciples and to the Jewish leaders, this sickness will not end in death. No, it is for God's glory, so that God's Son may be glorified through it. This is in verse 4. And by the time you read on a few more verses, you think that Jesus is maybe one of those deluded religious people. You know, we sometimes have people who set themselves up as prophets, sometimes in other religions, but also sometimes in the Christian faith. There were various American preachers who at the time of the last presidential election said that God had revealed to them that the previous president would be returned to office. And obviously that didn't happen. And if we are going to claim that God is saying something through us, it is much, much wiser to say what we have to say and allow others to weigh it and assess it, rather than prefacing it with thus saith the Lord, or this is what God is saying. Seems to me that that is very arrogant. But with Jesus, it was a whole different situation. He was not being arrogant or presumptive, and though he appeared in the first instance to be wrong, the subsequent events showed that he was right. And it is interesting to us, as we've been having this series of songs about the second coming, then there would be some who do not believe in the Christian faith, who say that Jesus' promise to return was obviously a foolish one. Because here we are some 2,000 years later, and Jesus has not returned. Now, if I was a gambling man, and I'm not, I think that is something for fools, I would put my money on Jesus' promises coming true. And we are in a situation where, as we go through this world, every day, we should, metaphorically speaking, have one eye upon this world and the things we need to do, but also one eye on the sky as we look for Jesus to keep his promise. I don't recommend that you try that physically. I think that would be a great eye strain, which at the moment I know all about eye strain. And for those who don't know, I'm not wearing these dark glasses because I'm attempting vainly to look cool. It is because I have very painful eyes whilst I'm waiting for my next eye operation. But don't give yourself a squint, but do be conscious that any day is a day when Jesus could return. Again, we're not going to be fools like the Jehovah's Witnesses were in the early part of the 20th century when they staked the whole of their ministry on fixing a date for Jesus to return. Jesus tells us that none except the Father in heaven knows that date. And if you are in any way engaging with a church that is given to making predictions of that kind, perhaps on the internet or something like that, I suggest very quickly that you disengage. And so, apparently against Jesus' promise, we are told, I always have my critics. We are told that Lazarus dies. And we are also told that Jesus wept. Now, sometimes if you play one of those trivia games, you will be asked the question, what is the shortest verse in the whole of the Bible? And the answer is this one in John chapter 11, Jesus wept. And it's interesting that a few years ago, although I haven't heard it for several years, that phrase became almost a curse word in the way that people in an ongoing way say Jesus Christ or something like that contemptuously. But this is not something that could ever be used to the detriment of Jesus' character, because it shows us how much Jesus, God incarnate, cares for us. But it is an extraordinarily difficult translation. You may know that the New Testament was written in Greek, and what we have in English is, at very best, a translation of that. And if you know anything about foreign languages, then words don't always line up exactly. And wept is a reasonable translation, but it is not the best translation. I was talking about this on Thursday with Ninoshka in our theology class, and we were talking about the way that different cultures through history have regarded the seat of the emotions as in different places. You know, today, Valentine's Day, we think of the heart as being the seat of the emotions. But if you get a Valentine's Day card from somebody and you, on the front of it, it has a picture of a literal human heart, that would be kind of ugly. You know, the heart we think of is the one that is that kind of cutesy thing that you see on Hallmark cards and things. But throughout history, other cultures have felt that the seat of the emotions was elsewhere. And the disturbing thing about the Jewish people at the time of Jesus was they regarded the seat of the emotions as being in the bowels, which is something to conject on. And so the word that is translated here literally means a pain in the bowels, like the grinding of horses' teeth. There's something for you to remember. I find it difficult to even imagine how something in your bowels can have a comparison with horses' teeth, but hey, I've never been given to hanging around horses. But the idea here, if you think about if you grit your teeth or you grind your teeth, is not just that Jesus wept, but he wept out of anger. And the question then becomes, what was Jesus angry about? Well, he could, for example, have been angry at God. Sometimes we are angry at God. But that makes no sense, because we know from what the Bible says that the Bible's perspective is that Jesus was God. He could have been angry at himself. But when he is relying on God to bring about a miracle here, that also seems to make no sense. The obvious choice, or I think obvious or best choice perhaps, is that Jesus was angry at death. And Jesus' view was that death was abnormal. It wasn't God's intention for the world. Just as we see in the book of Genesis that wrongdoing was abnormal and it changed human beings' relationships with God. And so Jesus, like us, longs for a time when there will be no more death. We read in the book of Revelation about a time when there will be no more death, no more sickness, no more tears. And this is the time of release that Jesus is looking for. And so we know that Jesus is on our side, that God is on our side. Through this whole time of the pandemic, God is on our side. And as dreadful as it is that people are sick, and that people in some instance have died, the great comfort is that God is with them. To be sick and alone, to die and be alone, is much more dreadful than to know that someone is with you. And not only a nurse or a doctor stands alongside you, but God himself. So that's a very somber part of the passage. The next thing is something that makes me smile a little bit, but perhaps for all the wrong reasons. Jesus comes to the tomb of Lazarus and asks the men to open up the tomb. And he is told that perhaps this didn't ought to be done because there would be a bad odor. Now, as I was saying, the English Bible is always a translation. And if you're familiar with the translation that we know as the King James Version, the Authorized Version from way back in the 17th century, obviously the language in that is a language that we seldom speak anymore, so there have been more modern translations. And the phrase for bad odor in this passage in that version of the Bible is simply that people say that he stinketh. And this kind of sounds weird to us because times has changed. But however we say this, whether it is a bad odor, which is obviously very polite, or whether we talk of stink or stinketh or bad smell, the important thing to realize is that this is real death. Not any shade of it, not any kind of pretense. Even Jesus softens the blow by referring to it metaphorically as sleeping. That people live even though they die. Again, this was in the song we heard a little while ago. Some will sleep, but will not die. It doesn't mean that they have gone to bed or that Lazarus had gone to bed. He was literally dead in a cave, covered over with a stone. And when I think of that, it makes the strongest connection of anything else I've ever heard with the story of the crucifixion and the resurrection. You know, you think about Joseph of Arimathea and Nicodemus asking for Jesus' body to be taken down the cross, and they placed Jesus' body in a tomb that was previously unused. Makes me think as well of the very first line in Charles Dickens' A Christmas Carol, where Dickens says, Marley was dead to begin with. And the story here, and the story of Jesus, and the story of Scrooge in fiction makes no sense unless someone is really, really, really dead. And Jesus is about to reveal something amazing. First of all, he says to his Father, I thank you that you have heard me. But he also makes it very clear that he says that not because he needs to, but because those who are listening will understand better what is happening amongst them. And that is the case of us having the Bible in these days. You know, it is, people have said to me in the past, oh, well, I'm too busy to read the Bible. Very, very few people these days are too busy to read the Bible. Most people are looking for ways to fill up their time in a way that is not repetitive. So we should be Bible students. And this is something that God has given us to help us understand the days that we live in. And if you say, well, I don't understand what's going on around me, to a certain degree, there's no way of understanding it. But to another part of understanding, the best way to understand is to turn your attention to the Bible. And so Jesus says this, I thank you that you have heard me, to give to those around an understanding of what God is doing. Because after this, there is something amazing. Because Lazarus comes forward from the tomb, on one level, presumably no longer smelling, but very much alive, but in a slightly ghoulish way, with the grave clothes still attached to him. Almost sounds like something like you might see a walking mummy in a horror film or something like that. But this is not horrific. This is the work of God. And this is lovely because it reveals to us the love of God and his work in Lazarus' life and the way that he is willing to work in our lives. In these difficult days that we have at the moment, look again for God to work in your life. It may not be that you will see Jesus coming on the cloud of heaven. Maybe not yet. Maybe that's for a time in the future. But if you look for God to do something, it is likely that he will be with you to make your burden easier. And you may say to me, well, Darren, how do I know that my burden is easier? And there is no answer to that, because no one gets to live their life through twice in parallel ways. And so you will never know how hard your life would have been if you didn't look to God. But if you don't look to God, life, especially now, will be a hard place to be. Don't put yourself through any more suffering than you need to have. Amen.